Alright everyone, welcome to part 5, Wing 5 of the Temple of Ahn'Qiraj adventure that I'm creating for r/slash custom Hearthstone. My name's Derek, at DM Rawlings on Reddit, and this is the fan-created adventure, the final wing. So without further ado, let's get into this one and pop up the guide here. So, the Vault of Cthulhu is our final destination in this adventure, and in it there's only two boss fights. There's Oru, and there's also Cthulhu. As mentioned before, that percentage there's a 20% chance each turn against Oru, or Uro. Yeah, that's going to be awkward for this entire thing. Anyways, moving on. 20% chance that one of the Whispers of Cthulhu's secrets will appear at the start of each turn. So basically, one in every 5 turns in the Oro fight, you're going to be getting some kind of super dangerous secret that drops into play that's going to mess with your stuff. And Oru as a boss is pretty dangerous. So let me just pop him up here. His hero power, Enrage, doubles Oru's attack, and the one thing that happens with him is he starts with an attack of 1, which is persistent, basically he gets an attack of 1 every turn, and if he spends 5 mana, then it doubles. So this simulates the Enrage timer, which is probably one of the key points of the actual encounter, is that as time goes on, Oru reaches a point of Enrage, and then he can basically just slap around all of the different people in the instance and kill them in 1 or 2 hits. On top of that, another interesting characteristic of the fight is that very often Oru, who is the father of Kurinax in the first wing, is that he submerges beneath the ground, and some time passes. So to do that, I've got this Submerge card, where you become immune until the start of your next turn, and you draw some cards, and that's just going to allow for him to persist into the later game. As far as the kind of deck that he plays, he's going to play a very low curve deck. And the reason for that is because once he hits turn 5, he doesn't want to be playing anything else. He just wants to be using his hero power to power up so that he can hit you in the face and knock you out. And as far as the cards that are picked, they're the cream of the crop in terms of creating a fantastic curve. So if you thought Mysterious Challenger had the perfect curve, you were wrong. It's going to start with Mana Worms, it's going to have Shielded Mini-Bots, Dark Cultist in the 3 slot, but it's also going to have a few other things. It's going to have a couple of Fencing Coaches, which will reduce the hero power cost to 0, and that's just thrown in to kind of not allow the enemy, or the player I guess in this situation, to accurately predict exactly when that Enraged hero power is going to get used. So it throws in a little bit of variance into the fight, and means that someone can't be counting and playing 3 turns ahead. It's going to play with Savagery as well, because the hero has a pretty reasonable attack. And it's also going to throw in a Tree of Life, because surprise, I like surprises, and let's give him something to do with the 9 mana slot. And lastly, Anubisath Warders, that are the actual reward for beating the fight. And those guys conditionally silence other things. So if you just try to throw up a taunt wall, it's very possible that Anubisath Warder comes down and silences that minion, the Enrage goes off, and then you get killed regardless. So it's going to be a really, really fast fight. But if you do manage to get through him, then I have a special gift for you. In the spirit of holiday giving. And that is the Anubisath Warder. So who is this guy? He's a 5 mana 5/5 with a battle cry that silences a minion of 3 or less attack. So why this card? Why did I decide to feature it? Really, it comes down to the fact that I really do think that this card is the secret, or is the future of silence. And we've begun to see that with Light's Champion as a minion that has a silence effect, but it's conditional instead of Ironbeak Owl and Spellbreaker, who are unconditional silences. So I don't think that Blizzard is ever going to publish another silence that is just silence, unless it's maybe a legendary minion. And I thought that I would kind of get above the curve and present a good option of what silence could be. And the Anubisath Warder is what I came up with in that regard. So what does it compare to? I've already mentioned them all. There's Ironbeak Owl and Spellbreaker. One's a 2-mana 2/1. One's a 4-mana 4/3. So we can see pretty quick that the cost of having a silence effect is 2 health for these unconditional silences. But you'll see in the case of the Anubisath Warder, he's only lost 1 stat point, like a vanilla 5/6 would be what would be expected in that particular scenario. But because there's a condition, it's 3 or less attack, it's enabled to be at that 5/5 spot, and obviously from playing Lotheb, 5-mana 5/5 is a very nice combination of stats to be able to throw on the table. It goes up incredibly favorable against Belchers, for instance, which wasn't really the design intention of the card, it just happens to work out that way. So the Warder has a substantial body compared to Ironbeak Owl and Spellbreaker, and it will be a menace on the field when it comes down. We can also compare it to Light's Champion, which is a 3-mana 4/3, and in that case it also has a condition that the enemy that is to be silenced must be a demon. It's way, way, way more likely that you'll be able to play the Anubisath Warder with a valid target than a Light's Champion. So while the Light's Champion has a positive array of stats, 3-mana 4/3, it seems to me that 5-mana 5/5 for a condition that's easier to meet makes a lot of sense. And I really see this card being used in decks that want to use silence, but also want to ensure that they're placing valuable minions on the table. So maybe while you've got an aggro deck that prefers the Ironbeak Owl because it costs 2 mana and you just wanted the silence anyway, maybe if you're a control warrior, for instance, maybe the Anubisath Warder makes more sense in that scenario because you get that 5/5 value minion that gets left behind. And as far as where these guys come from, these guys are a trash mob in the Vault of Cthulhu. They happen to use a silence effect, among other things, but the silence effect was the most interesting one. So that's that guy. And once you're done with Oro, you get to go up against Cthulhu himself. So what I'll do now is I'm going to put up the first page in the Oro fight, and forgive me, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail here in terms of what these fights actually do. And let me make this a little bit bigger as well. And maybe we'll get the guide out of the way. Oh, I'm sorry, I probably should have taken care of this beforehand. But here we go. When you actually face up against Cthulhu himself, it's a fight that's going to happen in 3 phases. In the first phase, you've got Dark Glare, which is a 2-mana hero power. It's only used at the start of the turn, which is if there are no enemy minions on the board, deal 10 damage. So it's a big, big threat if you aren't playing down minions on tempo. And the interaction that you get is basically at the start of the fight, you get Anachronos, who's been your guide through the entire thing, and for the very first time, he actually says something nice to you. He says, "I'm only saying this because you're doomed to a terrible death, but it has been an unusual honor working with you, hero." And then as you go into the fight, Cthulhu leads off with one of the lines of dialogue. If you YouTube Cthulhu speech or Cthulhu whispers, there's a YouTube video where Cthulhu lays out every single one of these things that he's got. They're super creepy and super weird, and I'm going to try to play them for you right now, just as a matter of course, but I'm honestly not sure how well they show up. So here we go.
Death is close. You are already dead. Your courage will fail. Your friends will abandon you. You betray your friends. You will die. You are weak. Your heart will explode.
So yeah, he's a really, really cheerful guy. And when you get into the fight, he leads off with "Death is close," and then whenever you use any kind of interactions against him, he'll pull from the list of all of the secret whispers that I've mentioned before, as well as "Death is close," and just spit them back at you. So really, in the early game, when you're fighting Cthulhu, you want to be able to play a minion every single turn and go up against their minions, and just basically oppose him and begin to work away at his health. So once you reach turn 7, or if Cthulhu has 12 or less health, then he transitions into his second phase, where Cthulhu actually eats you, which is something that he can do to the heroes in the game. And while you're in phase 2, there's a passive hero power that whenever Cthulhu takes damage, deal 2 damage to all enemies. So all sides are destroyed, some kind of fancy animation that happens. And then Anachronos pipes in and says, "Not quick enough, I'm afraid. You've been swallowed whole." And then Cthulhu says, "You will die." And then Anachronos says, "No need to worry. You should be able to punch your way out of this problem." And when the stomach gets reduced to 0 health, then it pops into phase 3. And in phase 3, you get the Gaze of Cthulhu, which is a 3 mana hero power, which summons 1/2 eye stalks until the battlefield is full. So why don't I just pull up the eye stalk now, just so you get a sense of exactly what that's supposed to be. There we go, the eye stalk of Cthulhu. So there are 2 mana, 1/2 minions. At the beginning of your turn, deal 1 damage to an undamaged enemy and minion. And yeah, basically he can pull an Onyxia on you every single turn, and your job is to beat Cthulhu down to 0 health. And there's nothing else fancy. It's just beat him down to that particular amount of health. Once that's done, we get the sound of Cthulhu dying, and hooray, you've beaten the adventure. And now a whole bunch of stuff is going to happen. But before I go too far with that, I should also switch this over, because there's a number of special cards that are used in the Cthulhu fight, which are not those, it's these. So here we go. You get the Eye Beam, which is 3 mana, silence a minion, deal 3 damage to it, and draw a card, which is crazy, like Cthulhu cheats, because he's the final boss of the game, and you should be able to cheat if you're the final boss of the game. There's also Giant Claw Tentacle, which is a 4 mana 2/5 taunt with Death Rattle. Summon 2 1/2 Claw Tentacles with taunt, which is like a super duper cheaper Belcher, but Cthulhu cheats because the AI is not good enough to not require cheating. And then the most dickish card of the ones that are there is the Whispers of the Old God, which is a 6 mana spell, which puts 3 random Cthulhu secrets into the battlefield. So this is kind of like Mysterious Challenger. You don't know what those secrets necessarily are, and they probably mess you up pretty bad. But yeah, Cthulhu is kind of an unfair fight. He has a whole bunch of health that's split across a whole bunch of phases. The strategy that you need to use in order to take him down transitions at least twice while you're doing this fight, and that means that he's a pretty serious dude to take down. But when you are successful, you reap the benefits of that. And the benefits happen to be one of my favorite cards in the entire set, which is the Divine Star, which is a 3 mana priest spell, which allows you to deal 1 damage to each enemy minion, and then restore 1 health to your hero for each enemy damaged. And notice by looking at that card there that health should have been capitalized. Oh well, I'll maybe correct that before I throw them up, but on Imager, but probably not. So what is this guy? This is a cheaper board clear option for priests. Important to note that it interacts with spell damage, so if you happen to have out Valence Chosen, then this card suddenly gets substantially better. But really, what this is intended to be is a good anti-aggro card. because it kills lots of things that only have one health that the aggro decks tend to use, and it also simultaneously bolsters the health of your hero. So if someone goes like turn 1 Leper Gnome and turn 2, I don't know, something else with 1 health, and then turn 3 Wolf Rider, you're able to respond with Divine Star and wipe out all of those enemies and restore 3 health to you for 3 mana. Or maybe you rush it out and you play it on turn 2 with a coin. Either way, you have this card as a way to basically have a um, little miniature Holy Wrath. No, that priest card that I don't use nearly enough. That costs 5 mana, does 2 damage to everything, and heals your stuff for 2. So this is a little micro version of that, which makes it better against aggro matchups, and really is just like puts it earlier in the curve. So what do we compare this guy to? Arcane Explosion and Consecrate are 2 really good examples because one costs 2 mana, one costs 4 mana, this costs 3 mana, so it lives in between all of those. With Arcane Explosion, it costs less. It has the same damage dealing effect, which a lot of people, Arcane Explosion isn't good enough to make it into a deck because dealing 1 damage to all enemy minions is not worth 2 mana. But with the additional ability to restore health to your hero for each damage, or each enemy that was damaged, I feel like that couldn't be 2. That's too much, and it would be power creep on, like legitimate power creep, because you have a card that's not used, but then you introduce a card that's used all the time, because this card is way better than 2 mana. But at 3 mana, it feels like it kind of hits a sweet spot. There's variance in the card because you only gain an amount of health equal to the number of minions that are out, which means that it's not the most reliable heal when you maybe compare it to, say, Flash Heal, which is 1 mana heal 5. But if you kind of think of it, you get the Arcane Explosion for 2 mana, and you sort of get like a Flash Heal that heals you for 5, but it's 1 to 5, or 1 to 7. And yeah, no, I think that works out. As far as cards that could see competitive play in the sets that I've done, I think Divine Star is probably among the most usable cards in the set. When you compare it to Consecrate, when you compare it to Consecrate, it costs Consecrate costs 1 more mana, but it inflicts 1 more damage to all minions. People run Consecrate, but they don't run Arcane Explosion. And that really leads me to believe that the second point of damage really, really matters, but there's also that synergy with Equality. And Priest doesn't really have anything else that kind of gives it that equivalent synergy. But in terms of the usefulness, if we dial back the damage to 1, that means that we're probably spending 2 mana for it, which seems pretty legitimate, and then we tack the healing effect on top of it, and healing is not as... Basically, you spend 1 mana on damage, you won't get as much damage as you get healing. So that's where I kind of see this cost of 3 really being the correct cost. I should mention as well, at one point Divine Star did damage to the enemy hero as well. It was to each enemy and restore 1 health for each enemy damaged, but ultimately, to play it on the safe side, I removed that and made it only affect enemy minions, because I didn't... Well, basically I wanted to err on the side of this card being balanced and being received well. So ultimately, I think this card is crazy balanced, and really, really would fit into existing priest decks and really provide them a ton of value. So again, I really like this one. As for balance, this next card probably needs a fair amount of talking about, because I don't know if I've necessarily gotten this balance correct, and the stats might be way out of line, but when it comes to Cthulhu, you kind of want to let yourself go a little crazy. So let me pull him up here. There's one half. And there's the other half. So, Cthulhu the Old God is a 9 mana, 3/11 minion. And when we look at 9 mana minions in the game, we know that there's some pretty stiff competition in that 9 mana spot. We've got Ysera, we've got Alexstrasza, Jaraxxus, Nefarian. All of these are some of the most powerful characters in Azeroth. And Cthulhu, as an old god, even if he's sort of still asleep, still should rank up there in a similar vein. So really I wanted to make sure that this card did Cthulhu, as an old god, the right kind of justice. So what does he do? He's got a battle cry that deals 4 damage, and that's his eyeball laser, like his red laser that you saw in the actual fight itself. Also, at the end of your turn, you summon 2 1/2 eye stalks. And the eye stalks, as I mentioned before, deal damage to undamaged minions. So yeah, that's Cthulhu. And he's probably the craziest, single most powerful card that I've ever designed. I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether you think this is balanced, but let me at least explain some of the comparisons that I made and why I decided to cost him the way that he does. So, obviously, Ysera is the single best point of comparison. And for the cost of Ysera, you get 1 extra attack, 1 extra health. Ysera has the Dragon Tribe, not that that matters particularly much in terms of the cost of the card. And Ysera gives card advantage, which is very unpredictable because there's a set of cards that you get to have 1 per turn on. Where Cthulhu really differs, aside from the minor stat differences, is that he helps you get board advantage, both by dealing damage to a minion, but also by placing additional minions that are very controlling in nature into play. So, in terms of the draw versus put into play effect, we've decided that drawing a card is normally worth about 1.5 mana, but Ysera cards are almost universally better than normal cards. They're cheaper, their effects are crazy, so they're probably worth around 2 mana per card. You look at the eye stalks, they're 1/2 minions with a small conditional effect. And even though the cost of the card is 2 mana, I really do think that they're not valued more than... Like, if you were to see a 1 mana 1/2 that dealt 1 damage to an undamaged minion, you'd probably think that that was okay, but not great. So, the relative value of the 2 cards, in terms of their ability to generate advantage, whether that's card advantage or board advantage, is almost entirely the same. In terms of the battle cry that Cthulhu has that makes it better than Ysera, that's where we need to look at the stats that Cthulhu does not have, so that's 1 attack and 1 health, and go to, and the lack of tribe. And now we go, does that dealing 4 damage offset the cost of the stats? And I think I can make an argument that it pretty much does. And the way that I do that is by comparing Cthulhu to the North Sea Kraken. And the North Sea Kraken surrenders 3 health. It would be a 9/10 vanilla minion if it didn't have that deal 4 damage effect. So we see that the North Sea Kraken has a crazy high attack value, which makes it an imminent threat on the board that must be removed no matter what, because it will kill you in like 3 turns if you don't do anything about it. Whereas in the case of Cthulhu, the attack is actually quite low. Like, he can't even beat up a Belcher in 2 attacks. It takes 3 attacks. So he's not really a big threat on the board when he drops down. And whereas the Kraken surrenders 3 of its health, I feel like the stat line that Cthulhu has, where he's not a big board threat. I mean, he's a big threat in the ability that he has and the 4 damage that he does and all of that, but his raw ability to do damage is not nearly as high, and therefore I feel like the 3 health that North Sea Kraken surrenders is roughly the same as 1 attack and 1 health, with the 311 stat line as compared to the 9-7 stat line. So North Sea Kraken helps justify for me that the battle cry is basically equivalent to the loss of the 2 stat points, at least in this particular situation. Could also make a comparison to Dr. Boom, but you know what, for sake of expediency, I think I'll cut that. Ultimately, if I was going to make a change to this card, I'd drop Cthulhu's health down to 10, just because while I feel that 11 is acceptable, I'm not completely convinced that it's balanced. So again, I really want to hear feedback on Cthulhu as a card. In terms of lore, I could go pretty deep into this. There are old gods in the World of Warcraft, and these are mysterious, godlike, and greatly malefic horrors which ruled in tyranny over the infinite universe before they were defeated and sequestered within the primordial world of Azeroth by the Titanic Pantheon. So these guys have been around forever. There was a big battle. They controlled the elementals. They lost. And their power was so great that they could not be destroyed. So instead, they were castrated and they were buried beneath the earth in hopes that they'd never ever come back, which, if you've ever read any kind of fantasy story ever, is a terrible idea. But, you know, you're also in the middle of a fantasy story, so you're going to fall into those tropes. By extension, FYI, that description pulled directly from the Wowpedia. Legend says there are a total of 5 old gods, but we really only have documentation on 3, maybe 4 of them so far. So we have Cthulhu, we have Yogg-Saron, who's associated to the Faceless Manipulator card that's in the game already. We have N'Zoth, who also does something. But the thing with Cthulhu is he exists not sleeping nor fully awake in the heart of Ahn'Qiraj. He created the Qiraji, he crafted them in his image from the Silithid, who happened to be around him while he was semi-dormant. And no one really knows what happened to kind of sort of wake him up, but there's some stuff in the comic book about Shogal performing some kind of ritual that may have woken him up. And in terms of where you're going to see Cthulhu, he's an amazing board control card. So any kind of deck that yearns for board control might want to see him played. Probably not in dragon decks, though, because he doesn't have that tag, and there's other 9-cost dragons that would push him out. Yeah, that's Cthulhu the Old God. Also, if you happen to beat the entire adventure, so all 5 wings, you're also given a unique gift, which is our host for this adventure, Anachronos. And he's a 7-mana 5/8 dragon that happens to have a battle cry which returns a minion to its owner's hand. There's an apostrophe missing in there. God, I'm slacking in terms of card pedantry. But when that minion is in its hand, the cost is set to 1. And this enables all kinds of interesting personal uses of the card. So I happen to have played Alexstrasza last turn, and for some reason he lived, and then the next turn I play Anachronos. I return Alexstrasza to my hand. I play him again, he costs 1. So if I'm losing a game and my health is 2 and then I set it to 15, maybe I can set it to 15 again. You know, it's a pretty powerful effect, but it's also versatile because it can be used offensively as well. So you can take an enemy minion and you can return it to their hand, and maybe it's a taunt minion, and that allows you to win the game, or maybe there's some kind of negative battle cry that they would have to do again. I don't know. It is one of those cards that that really does allow you to play it in a few different ways. So I guess the first question in my initial design, I had them cost 0. I decided not to do that because if you've got a duplicate, for instance, then you'd be able to get multiple Anachroni in your hand, and then you could cast Anachronos to return your Anachronos to your hand for 0, and then play him for 0, and then return the other Anachronos and play him for 0, and cause this endless loop. And when you do that, as I'm sure you know from Nosdormu, who is also a member of the same Dragonflight as Anachronos, then you get time dilation that messes up your opponent on their turn, and that's really not very fair, so let's just nip it in the bud by making it cost 1 and force people to spend resources towards it. It has the Dragon Tribe. It is the second 7-mana dragon. I thought it was the first, but then I remembered Chillmaw. You know, Chillmaw being Chillmaw. So yeah, I guess the big point of comparison here are the Brewmasters. All the Brewmasters have really good stats for their mana cost. So you look at Youthful, and he's a 2-mana 3/2, so he doesn't really pay a lot for the ability to return a minion because it's forced. And similarly, Anachronos' ability is forced. You have to do it. You can't not do it if there's another minion on the board. But because Anachronos has more flexibility in that you can target enemy cards, I've costed the Dragon's ability better than the Brewmasters. So Anachronos loses 2 points of stats in order to make his Battlecry a possibility. You can also compare it to Sap, which is a 2-mana card that returns an enemy minion to its owner's hand, whereas Anachronos causes the cost to be 1, which makes it easy to replay next turn. Sap makes it more expensive, or, well, the same cost as it was before. So it could, technically, you could return a target dummy to their hand and make it cost 1 mana for some reason if you really wanted to do that. But it really is, because Anachronos' cost higher, it's not really the same kind of tempo play. Like, you wouldn't play this in a tempo rogue deck because you wanted to remove a minion on, say, turn 5 to get that kill. Anachronos is a much, much later game card. Other cards like Kidnapper, which is a terrible card, I could really compare it to, but who cares? I'm cutting for brevity. In terms of lore, Anachronos is the son and heir of Nosdormu of the Bronze Dragonflight. So originally the Bronze Dragonflight wanted nothing to do with the War of Shifting Sands, which was that deal with the gong being run and all the scarabs coming up from the walls that kind of predate the World of Warcraft. But the Kiraji went after the Caverns of Time, which is their stronghold and also a place where they hold something that is super important to them because they're masters of time and they don't want anyone messing with time, although it happens all the time. And when that happened, they committed to going after the temple, and they recruited all of the other dragonflights to help them, and each of them gave a little bit of support. So as a result of that, Anachronos is in charge of that operation, and he's intrinsically tied to Ahn'Qiraj. His magics, once upon a time, helped create the Scarab Wall in the first place. He created the Scarab Gong, and he watches over the temple. So he really, really makes a good host. And where you would use a card like Anachronos, maybe as a finisher to get around taunt minions, but he's pretty expensive for that purpose. More likely you're going to have this weird gimmick deck where you want multiple battle cries to go off. So maybe you play him with Bran, and he returns a minion to his hand with a really nice battle cry, like say a Bomb Lobber, and then you play the Bomb Lobber again, and you get 4 damage to 2 random minions, and you win the game that way, which is kind of weird. I don't think it'll work, but I think people would try, and that's fun. And really, I see Anachronos as more of a fun card that might accidentally become viable at some point. So That's something. Lastly, I think that it probably complements mill decks as well, because you need ways to get those cold lights back into your hand. So even though he's a super expensive option there, he's just one more way that that can happen. All right, on to the class challenges. First off, there is a Paladin deck that you can use to face off against Oro. And the kind of deck that it's going to be is a very token-heavy deck with a tempo-style curve. And among them will be the Silverhand Sergeant, which is the reward for that particular class challenge. And ultimately, it's supposed to show you that you can swarm the board with a whole bunch of tokens, play cards that make your Silverhand recruits better, and basically power up and win the game. And when you defeat that, you get the Silverhand Sergeant. He's a Paladin card, or she's a Paladin card, 3 mana, 4/3. Battle Cry, put a random Paladin secret into the battlefield. So that's not from your deck, that's just from the ether. And that's interesting because it grants a certain kind of card advantage without any kind of investment in your part. And the design origin of this card was that I wanted to make Paladin secrets good. And you may laugh about that, but this was before Mysterious Challenger was really a thing. And even after Mysterious Challenger is a thing, I still don't think this card would belong in a secret Paladin deck. The reason for that is because it's anti-synergistic. It's an extra secret that can't be predicted, that is going into play, that won't necessarily be played on the same turn as an existing Mysterious Challenger. It doesn't add to the Mysterious Challenger effect. In fact, it barely interacts with Mysterious Challenger in any way. It just makes cards that it makes Secret Keepers a little bit better because they're put into the battlefield, and that triggers the Secret Keeper. But legitimately, in a Challenger deck or in a Secret deck, the 3 mana card that is played over and over again is Muster for Battle, and I don't think this card would supplant it because of the need for the Challenger deck to have minions in play at all points to be valid target for some of the secrets that do trigger. So really, I see this card as a tempo style card that you can put down on the third turn. Paladin has some good 3-drops, but they're not necessarily 3-drops that you would play on turn 3, Muster aside. Muster serves a very different purpose, and in that kind of deck, you would probably run Silverhand Sergeant as well as Muster for Battle. So we can definitely compare this to Mad Scientist. Mad Scientist has a Death Rattle that summons a secret from your deck, whereas the Silverhand Sergeant has a Battle Cry that summons something from the ether. Mad Scientist is cheaper and has a pretty substantial cost to put a secret into the battlefield, but because we know that it's a Paladin secret, we know that the value of that card is going to be less than 1 mana, because each of those Paladin secrets probably aren't worth a mana, but because it's specifically Paladin secrets, we can make it a fairly offensive-minded minion as a 4/3, and have better stats than the Mad Scientist. Keep in mind as well that it's any secret, so it's less predictable. Like with Mad Scientist, you can massage your deck to make sure that you get the secrets that you want. You can't do that with the Silverhand Sergeant. You can also compare it to Ram Wrangler, which is my most disliked card in Hearthstone, because it allows you to spend 5 mana to get anywhere between a 3/3 minion and a Web Spinner, or a 3/3 minion and King Crush, which has a range of values between 1 and 9 mana. When you compare Silverhand Sergeant to that, you see that the value of the Battle Cry is locked at 1 mana. While not all of those secrets are created equal, all of them are conditionally useful sort of somewhere, So there's far, far less variance in the Silverhand Sergeant. That makes it far more desirable from a game design standpoint. The second class challenge is the Cthulhu fight all over again. And when you defeat that deck, and that deck is going to be all about using your secrets and combating, like basically antagonizing the secrets that Cthulhu has, as well as having a lot of cards that synergize with the secrets that you do have. And I think that'll be a lot of fun to play, but honestly, I'm way more excited about the card that you get, which is the Arcanavore. When you beat Cthulhu, you get this 3 mana 3/3 minion. Its special text is whenever this minion is targeted by a spell, put an Arcanavore into your hand. So this is probably the weirdest card that I have in the set, but it's among my favorites as well. The objective of the card is that it conditionally grants card advantage if it's targeted by spells. It has a really interesting flexibility. If your target, or if your opponent targets it with something like, say, a swipe, then you get another Arcanavore, so it's incredibly valuable in that situation. If there's like a Frostbolt, then they're spending 2 mana to make you cast it next turn all over again. But if you play with secrets, or sorry, if you play with spare parts, and if you play with cards that target your minions, then the Arcanavore allows for you to hold on to those cards for a while, drop an Arcanavore, play a couple of cards on top of it, maybe play it with Genie of the Zephyr, if I remember the name of that card correctly, and that allows for that effect to stack on top of it. So the Genie gets the ability to, and you get another Arcanavore in your hand. And, some kind of weird duplicate deck could really see an advantage of this. Like the Arcanavores, they just don't stop. Or maybe it's the equivalent of a hat deck for the mage class. And when it does come to comparisons, obviously we go straight to Grim Patron, because it's got a very Grim Patron-like effect, in that it provides additional copies of itself, but you'll notice that it costs 2 mana less for the same stat line, and the reason for that is instead of putting them into play and having a card that just plays itself over and over again, instead it goes into your hand, allowing you to play it when you want, which is an advantage maybe, but it also means that you've got to spend more mana to get that value out of the card. And for that reason, I think a 3 mana 3/3 is perfectly justified. Yeah, we can also compare it to the Bane sister brother cards, which also have an effect when targeted with a spell. And honestly, Arcanavore is a wonderful complement to those cards. It doesn't really compete. You'll see that its stats aren't quite as strong. The effect is arguably better, or maybe worse, but it's not a legendary. Arcanavore is definitely the more pesky of those minions, though. Like, having an extra copy of it in your hand is probably even more obnoxious than it getting Divine Shield. And lastly, in terms of lore for this particular card, this has nothing to do with Ahn'Qiraj at all. I just had this effect, and I had this name for a card, and they felt really right, so I slapped them into the set and put an epic rarity on it, because it's the level of complexity where you would think that it probably should be an epic card, and just kind of let it ride, because I think that this kind of card belongs in the game, because it's a lot of fun. So that's pretty much it. 5 wings later, with, what's it, 34 cards? I'd have to look that up. Later, I've completed this adventure, and I wanted to say thank you for putting up with me for all this time, because I wanted to try this medium out and see what it's like. I'm going to do a full retrospective on my thoughts toward it afterwards, and I'll create a written form of that so I can pass it along to people in the custom Hearthstone community in terms of things to look out for. I know there's a lot of things that I want to talk about this process of going through it, and I also am beginning to iterate on this a bit. The next adventure that I want to do is going to use a format much more similar to Blizzard's new adventure, the League of Explorers, because that looks like an awful lot of fun. So, anyway, thanks once more for sticking with me for all of this, and I hope you enjoyed it. And again, I'm always up for a conversation about how you feel about the cards.